There's a specific kind of silence you only find in the deep Rockies, the kind that smells like pine needles and feels like heavy, comfortable memories, which is exactly what I was desperate for when my Uncle Ray passed away last February, leaving me everything he owned. I'm Jack Miller, a 46-year-old civil engineer and professional land surveyor, and frankly, my life was in shambles after a brutal divorce where I was fighting tooth and nail just to see my kids, Lily and Cole. So when the will was read, and I realized Ray had left me the entirety of Silver Creek Ranch, 1,500 acres of pristine wilderness that had been my childhood sanctuary, I thought the universe was finally throwing me a lifeline. It was supposed to be the place where I could rebuild, a place where Lily, who's 12 and still believes in magic, and Cole, who's 15 and pretending he's too cool to care, could finally breathe without the weight of their parents' custody war hanging over their heads. I remember driving up that gravel access road, the tires crunching in a rhythm that used to signal freedom, expecting to see nothing but the dilapidated cabin and the glistening surface of the lake. But instead, I was met with the harsh, electronic screech of a brand new security gate that definitely wasn't there in the 80s. Before I could even process the geographical impossibility of a gate on my private road, a pristine white G-Wagon rolled up, the window sliding down to reveal a woman who looked like she'd been vacuum sealed into a $500 hiking outfit that would dissolve if it ever touched actual mud. This was Eleanor Vance, the self-appointed queen and president of the Summit View Conservancy, an HOA that I didn't belong to, didn't sign up for, and certainly didn't invite onto my land. She stepped out of that car with the confidence of a colonial conqueror, waving a sheaf of documents that looked ancient and important, telling me, without even asking my name, that there was some confusion regarding the boundaries. She pointed a manicured finger toward the shoreline, my shoreline, the place where Uncle Ray taught me to cast a fly rod, and my jaw nearly hit the dirt because sitting right there, gleaming like a polished diamond in a coal mine, was a $3.2 million mansion, complete with floor-to-ceiling glass, a wraparound deck, and a helicopter pad where our old fire pit used to be. Eleanor smiled this tight, condescending smile, explaining that according to these historic 1880s mining charters, the lakefront had always been community trust property, and she, in her infinite benevolence, was simply stewarding it for the public good, which was a funny way of describing a private palace guarded by armed security who looked ready to tackle me for breathing too loud. It was surreal, standing there holding Ray's battered old survey tripod, the brass cold against my fingers, listening to this woman explain how my inheritance was actually her kingdom, and when I tried to protest, telling her I held the deed to all 1,500 acres, she just handed me a card with the logo of a high-end law firm, told me that historical precedent superseded my quaint, modern deed, and drove off, leaving me standing in the dust of her luxury SUV. That night, I walked the perimeter, or at least the part one could get to, and saw the orange spray paint marking community property on trees that had been in my family for generations, and I felt this sickness in my gut, not just because of the theft, but because I had to call my kids and tell them the trip was off. Things spiraled downward with terrifying speed because Eleanor wasn't just a thief, she was a strategist. 2 days later, while I was staying in a motel in town because her security team physically blocked my access road, Sheriff Cobb knocked on my door with a restraining order. She had filed a claim stating I was an unstable veteran posing a threat to the community, citing those same mining documents which were now notarized and looked incredibly official, barring me from coming within 500 feet of the shoreline, effectively locking me out of the most valuable 60% of my own land. My ex-wife, Rachel, caught wind of the legal trouble and immediately used it to file a motion to suspend my visitation rights. So in the span of 48 hours, Eleanor Vance had stolen my home, my heritage, and was actively destroying my relationship with my children. But here is the thing about bullies like Eleanor. They underestimate the guys who work with the details, the guys who look at the fine print for a living. I took a closer look at the copies of the 1880s mining agreements she had attached to the restraining order, and as I sat there in that dim motel room, the smell of cheap coffee in the air, something felt off, not legally, but physically. The paper had that distinct, crisp snap of fresh laser printing, and the aged look seemed too uniform, like a filter you'd slap on an Instagram photo. So I called up an old friend from engineering school, Leo Vasquez, who runs a high-end survey firm in Denver, and asked him for a massive favor. I needed a forensic document examiner, the best money could buy, even if it was money I didn't have, because my gut was telling me that history doesn't smell like fresh toner. I spent $800 to have Dr. Eris Thorne, a retired federal document specialist, look at Eleanor's proof, and within 10 minutes, the man was literally laughing. He pointed out things I would have missed in 1,000 years. The watermark on the paper was from a mill that didn't exist until 2019. The font was Times New Roman, which wasn't designed until the early 90s, and the notary stamp was from a UPS store down the highway. She had downloaded a template, soaked it in coffee, and baked it in an oven, a high school art project masquerading as federal evidence. That was the spark, the first tiny flame of hope in the darkness. But I knew proving the documents were fake wouldn't be enough to physically remove a mansion and a helicopter pad, so I told Leo to bring the heavy artillery. I needed a full geodetic boundary survey, the kind that uses GPS satellites and ties into government benchmarks, the kind that costs a fortune and holds up in the Supreme Court, and I needed it done yesterday. While Leo mobilized his crew, I drove back to the property line to confront Eleanor, finding her overseeing the installation of a marble fountain on ground that I was 99% sure belonged to me. When she saw me, she put on that same terrifyingly calm mask, asking if I was violating the court order, but I just asked her about the boundaries, and that's when I saw it. A flicker of panic when she glanced toward the woods where a different her survey crew, was quietly packing up gear. She knew. She absolutely knew she was building on my land, which meant this wasn't an innocent mistake or a historical misunderstanding. It was a calculated invasion. I walked back to my truck, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and called Leo again, telling him we needed to accelerate the timeline because Eleanor wasn't just stealing land, she was planning to expand, and if I didn't stop her soon, my family legacy would be buried under concrete and arrogance. The level of pettiness she displayed was almost impressive if it wasn't ruining my life. The next morning, I found out she had petitioned the county to declare my access road abandoned, using more fake records to claim nobody had driven on it since the 19th century, forcing me to hike through the dense forest just to get to the survey markers. But that hike was a blessing in disguise because it led me to the original 1920s brass caps, the government markers that define reality no matter what a lawyer says. I set up my uncle's old equipment, verified the coordinates with my handheld GPS, and when the numbers came back, the world stopped spinning. Eleanor's mansion wasn't just over the line. It was 300 feet inside my property. The marina, the helipad, the fountain, none of it was on Summit View Conservancy land. She had built her entire empire on pure, unadulterated wilderness that belonged to me, assuming I'd be too poor or too stupid to check the math. The realization that Eleanor Vance had constructed a multi-million-dollar compound entirely on my land didn't just give me leverage. It gave me the moral high ground to wage absolute war, but I knew that walking into a courtroom would take years, and she had the kind of money that could drag legal proceedings out until my kids were in college. I needed something faster, something visceral, something that would publicly dismantle her illusion of power. I met with Leo at a diner 3 towns over to avoid Eleanor's spies, and he laid out the certified maps, shaking his head in disbelief at the sheer scale of her audacity. She wasn't just trespassing, she was committing massive tax fraud, paying taxes on 12 acres while occupying 40, and she had filed for permits using coordinates that were half a mile away from where she actually built. She's throwing a party, Leo mentioned, tapping a printout of an invitation he'd found online. It was a gala for the preservation of community heritage, a black tie event she was hosting this Saturday to celebrate her victory over the greedy outsiders trying to steal the lake, meaning me. She had invited 200 of the state's wealthiest donors, local politicians, and the media to come marvel at the land she had stolen. It was the perfect stage. I went back to the property, hiking in through the backwoods to avoid the cameras she'd set up on the main road, and I stood by the creek that separated the county road from my land. There used to be an old timber bridge there, long gone, but the concrete footings were still solid, and as I stared at the rushing water, the civil engineer in me woke up. This bridge was the only way in or out for vehicles. If I rebuilt it, I controlled access, And if I engineered it with a little surprise, I could control who stayed. I spent the next 3 days in a fever state, sleeping 4 hours a night, working under the cover of darkness to reconstruct that bridge. To the naked eye, it looked like a sturdy, rustic timber structure, perfectly safe for a fleet of luxury cars. But underneath, hidden by the creek banks and dense foliage, I installed a high-pressure hydraulic system scavenged from heavy machinery parts. It was a simple mechanism, 2 industrial cylinders connected to a release valve that I wired to a remote switch hidden behind a massive oak tree 50 feet away. When triggered, the center span wouldn't just unlock. It would drop smoothly into the creek bed, creating a 6-foot gap that was impassable for anything without tank treads. While I was building my trap, Eleanor ramped up the pressure, sending her community safety patrol, basically retirees in golf carts, to harass me, circling the perimeter like vultures. I set up trail cams, the cheap $49 kind from the hardware store, and caught them red-handed driving over Federal Bureau of Land Management territory to get to my flank. I sent the footage to the federal rangers, knowing that disturbing federal land carries automatic criminal charges. Planting a legal landmine she wouldn't step on until it was too late. By Friday, the bridge was done, tested, and terrifyingly effective. Seeing that heavy timber span drop and retract with the push of a button was the most satisfying engineering feat of my career. But I needed witnesses, undeniable proof that would withstand her spin machine. So I contacted Maya Lin, an investigative reporter who had been sniffing around Summit View Conservancy for months, sensing that something stank about their finances. I told her to bring a camera crew on Saturday, promising a story involving fraud, bribery, and a climax she wouldn't believe. And then I called Sheriff Cobb, showing him the undeniable proof of the fake documents and the tax evasion, explaining that I wasn't the crazy veteran Eleanor painted me to be, but a property owner about to enforce his rights. The tension was suffocating as Saturday arrived. The sky was a mocking, perfect blue, and by late afternoon, the parade of wealth began. I hid in the tree line, clutching the remote trigger in a sweaty hand, watching as Bentleys, Porsches, and Mercedes sedans rolled across my bridge, their tires thumping rhythmically over the timber I had laid with my own hands. They were driving right into the spider's web, 200 of the most influential people in the state, carrying checks meant to fund Eleanor's legal war against me, completely unaware they were trespassing on a crime scene. I watched from the shadows as the party kicked into high gear, the sound of a string quartet drifting over the water, the smell of expensive catering masking the rot of the situation. Eleanor was in her element, holding court on the deck of the mansion she didn't own, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my truck. Maya Lin and her news crew were there, filming the opulence, and I waited, my heart pounding in my ears, for the sun to dip just low enough, for the maximum number of guests to be present, and for Eleanor to start her speech. She took the microphone, her voice amplified across the lake, and began spouting the same lies she'd told me, talking about protecting our heritage and fighting off those who wish to privatize our shared history. It was sickening, seeing people applaud her theft, seeing them toast to her crimes. Maya Lin, bless her sharp instincts, stepped up with the camera rolling and asked Eleanor about the rumors of boundary disputes. Eleanor laughed it off, calling me mentally unstable on live TV, doubling down on the fake 1880s documents, sealing her fate in high definition. That was my cue. I stepped out of the woods, holding the large, rolled-up survey maps that Leo had certified that morning. Eleanor's face went from smug to confused as I walked onto the lawn, the cameras immediately swinging toward me. Actually, I said, my voice shaking slightly before finding its steel, I think it's time we talk about who actually owns the ground you're standing on. Eleanor tried to have security remove me, but I unrolled the map right there in front of the county commissioners and the donors, pointing to the bright orange survey stakes Leo had secretly driven in during the chaos of the party setup. This mansion, I announced, looking directly into the camera, is 318 feet onto my property. This marina is 200 feet over the line. And this party? Every single one of you is currently trespassing on private land. Eleanor shrieked, losing her composure entirely, screaming that I was a liar and a danger to the community. And that's when I turned to the crowd and said, if she's so confident this is her land, Ask her why she tried to bribe the county assessor yesterday to change the maps. The silence that fell over that crowd was heavier than the mountains surrounding us. You have no right to be here, Eleanor yelled, storming toward me. Get off my property. Your property? I asked, backing toward the tree line near the bridge controls. I'm afraid you're confused, Eleanor. But let me help you understand boundaries. I reached the hidden switch. Eleanor froze, sensing the shift in the air, her eyes darting from me to the bridge. What are you doing? Exercising my rights, I said, and I flipped the switch. The sound of the hydraulic system engaging was a low, mechanical hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground, followed by a collective gasp from 200 wealthy throats as the center span of the bridge, the only exit route for their six-figure vehicles, dropped smoothly away, leaving a gaping, 6-foot chasm over the rushing creek water. It was absolute, beautiful pandemonium. The string quartet stopped playing, the champagne glasses stopped clinking, and the illusion of Eleanor's untouchable empire shattered instantly. She stood there, mouth agape, watching as her guests realized they were trapped on an island of her own making, their luxury cars transformed into useless metal statues. "You can't do this," she screamed, her voice cracking, stripping away the veneer of the sophisticated matriarch to reveal the desperate criminal underneath. "This is kidnapping. This is insanity. It's civil engineering." I corrected her, calm now that the deed was done. "Sheriff Cobb will be here in 5 minutes to explain the rest." And right on cue, the sheriff emerged from the hiking trail, not the main road, walking across a small footbridge I'd left intact upstream. He wasn't alone. He had state investigators with him. The arrest wasn't dignified. Eleanor tried to play the victim, then the outraged dignitary, but when Sheriff Cobb read the list of charges, felony fraud, tax evasion, bribery of a public official, and willful trespassing, the handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that felt like justice finally arriving home. The most poetic moment came when her personal helicopter pilot, realizing he was low on fuel and seeing the bridge was out, tried to make an emergency water landing and swamp the marina, soaking the front row of onlookers. The aftermath was a slow-motion demolition of Eleanor's life. The news footage of the bridge dropping went viral overnight, but the real story was the forensic evidence. It turned out she had been running this scam for a decade, collecting HOA dues for land she didn't own and pocketing the difference. The court ordered the Summit View Conservancy dissolved, declaring it an illegal entity. As for the mansion, the judge gave me the option to keep it, but I didn't want that bad energy on my land. I hired a crew to dismantle it, and in a twist of fate, I hired the original contractor Eleanor had used. She had stiffed him on the final payment, so he was more than happy to tear it down for me at a discount. 6 months later, the shoreline was restored to its natural state. The concrete was gone, the grass was growing back, and the silence had returned, but this time it was a happy silence. Lily caught her first trout right where the mansion's living room used to be, and Cole, who had been so distant, actually smiled when he helped me set up the new sign at the entrance, the Raise Horizon Initiative. We turned the property into a wilderness retreat for veterans with PTSD, a place where guys like me and Uncle Ray could find some peace, funded entirely by the restitution payments seizing Eleanor's remaining assets. Eleanor is currently serving 18 months in a minimum security facility, and I heard she's teaching a library organization class to fellow inmates, which feels appropriate. The Karen, who tried to steal a mountain, learned that you can fake a document, but you can't fake a coordinate, and you certainly can't out-engineer a man who measures the world for a living. But sitting here by the fire, watching the stars reflect off the lake that is finally, truly ours, I do wonder about the line we walk. I humiliated a woman on live television, stranded innocent bystanders, and destroyed a beautiful, albeit illegal, house. Was it extreme? Maybe. But when someone tries to rewrite history to steal your future, do you turn the other cheek, or do you drop the bridge? I think Uncle Ray would have dropped the bridge. So, tell me, was I the hero of this story, or just a guy who took petty revenge to a professional level? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where the math always wins.